Again, Mark Kovacs for the folks that don't know. Excited to be here. Looking forward. Today's discussion is going to be mainly on the serve, but I'm going to leave some time at the end to do some Q&A. So I'm going to go through some big picture things on the serve to make sure that we've got some clarity around what we're trying to work on and the difference sort of between style and fundamentals. The big challenge for all of us is many times when we're talking about the serve, we look at the best players and we say we want to serve like them. And then I always ask the next question is, does your body move like them? And if your body doesn't move like them, don't try to serve like them. Bad stuff usually happens when we do that. So we got to make sure that you are realistic in what we're trying to accomplish. If you don't jump and the person you're trying to mimic jumps when they serve, you're not going to look the same, you're not going to load the same, you're not going to come out of the load the same way. So that's one example. You know, if you've had 2 shoulder surgeries and you're trying to get this maximum angle here, it's probably not going to happen. So every good pro does that. That's why they're a pro, because their body can do those things. If our body can't do those things, understand that and then be willing to do workarounds. Nothing wrong with workarounds. That means that, hey, if I can't fully get in this position, then I'm going to get in that position and I'm going to utilize the best I can in that environment. So today's discussion is going to be all on technique, not on strategy of the serve, because that's a whole nother discussion. But again, it's a lot of fun to talk through this. We've been working through this. There's a slide, a bunch of names there I always put up, basically people that mentored me, that I learned from. A lot of researchers, a lot of great coaches, a lot of people that you know, have helped shape sort of the field of serving in general. And it's varied because you've got people that have very strong opinions one way or the other. This is how I like to coach. I don't do this, I only do that. This is not that type of discussion. This is much more about what does the real research tell us about what are the fundamental commonalities between all the great servers. Not about the style. The stylistic part is what makes them all look different. If I was asking you, you know, between a Serena Williams and a John Isner and a Nick Kyrgios, they have the same basic serve mechanics, yes or no? Yes. The fundamentals are nearly identical. The styles are obviously very, very different. If you watch all 3 of them, you would think they look quite different. And in certain parts of the motion they do, but when it really matters, their fundamentals, how they load, how they release the load, where their joint angles are at the important points in the motion, where they make contact, is all somewhat similar. So we have to sort of take that into account when we're thinking about it from our perspective. Again, a lot of this has come from looking at this over nearly 20 years now of trying to understand the serve, not so much from what the best individual server does, but what are the similarities between all the best servers, so the commonalities. And we sort of developed this 8-stage model to understand it, and we stole a lot of that from baseball, to be fair. The baseball literature was about 15 years ahead of the tennis literature. There was predominantly a group out of Birmingham, Dr. James Andrews and a crew there, the American Sports Medicine Institute, that did a ton of great stuff in the 90s on baseball pitching. And we said, let's not recreate the wheel. Let's just mimic what they did, but adjust it to the tennis serve. They had a 6-stage model because there's no ball toss, basically, is where the difference is in pitching. So we have an 8-stage model for tennis. Yeah. If you want to get into the weeds on this stuff, send me an email. I'll send you all the studies. We have about 150 paper research database of pretty much every published research study out there on the serve. And there's a lot of stuff that gets into the weeds. If you've got an engineer mind, there's a lot of cool stuff in there. If you don't, I would highly recommend you not ask for those papers because they're really, really getting into the weeds. So in general, I want to give you a couple quick slides first off. Everyone says, okay, so what do the best servers do? I use a 120 mile an hour example because there's servers out there now that can serve 140 and getting close, pushing close to 150 now when they really, really load. But there are some requirements that need to happen for you to get up to like that 120 mile an hour range. So a lot of the concepts here, you know, is when you look at this, it's the contact point and where it is in space and how quickly. There's 2 major correlates with serve speed. Anyone know what they are? Take a guess. No idea? So there are two major correlations with serve speed, meaning that there are two factors that above and beyond everything else is consistent with every fast serve out there. So what do you think that would be? Pronation. Okay, pronation. Leg drive. So one fluid motion. You're on the right track. Racket head speed. Toss location. So I like the way everyone's thinking. You're sort of thinking through it in your head. Okay, what is important if I want to serve fast? So from the data, and this has been repeated multiple times in different labs, it's very consistent. The speed that the back hip goes vertical, so from load, going back to loading of the leg. The problem when people say loading of the legs, it's very broad. It's a broad term. The specifics of what's important is how quickly the back hip, so for a right-hander, your right hip, how quickly it goes from the lowest point of the load to the highest point. So vertical displacement is called. Vertical displacement of the back hip. That's the most important factor actually, more than anything else, because if that doesn't happen right, then you have to make up for that lack of velocity in other parts of your body. So this summation of forces from the ground up into the arm doesn't occur efficiently if that piece of the puzzle isn't done correctly. So that's step one. The next biggest correlation is how quickly we go from this position through contact into, someone mentioned pronation earlier, into that kind of whole trajectory. So it's a little bit more than pronation. You know, coaches, and it was a fair term to use in the 80s and 90s when we didn't have as much information. Pronation was a term that is still overly used. It's a little bit more than pronation though. Pronation is just forearm, so going from here to there, that's pronation. So if I put my racket like this and I do that, that's it, that's pronation. We know that that by itself is not really the most important part of the serve because there's such a little movement. It's actually called long axis rotation, or it's defined that way, which is a much more accurate term. It's internal shoulder rotation with pronation. So it's a combination. So it's the entire long axis, meaning the entire arm, goes from here, which is actually supination to an extent, comes through contact and finishes out there. So that piece and that speed of that movement is vital. So for all of you, if we can improve your back hip vertical displacement and improve your ability to get through this range faster, your serve speed goes up. It's as simple as that from a theoretical standpoint, but we all know it's quite hard practically to do those two things really, really well. And that's why you're here. You've got a bunch of great coaches that are working with you to help you improve those two things. But if speed's important to you and spin, those are the two things we need to be great at.
Sheldon's probably the most visual example of that, with the positioning loads and how fast he goes up.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about Ben Shelton on how deep he gets into his load and how violently he comes out of it. Andy Roddick had a similar kind of, mechanics, very violent in the visual of it, unbelievably well synced. Like, there are plenty of players that go as deep as Ben does and never come out of it very fast. And we see a lot of players that struggle with that. They try to copy it, so they get low, but every millisecond they get stuck in the bottom and they don't utilize that stored energy is wasted energy and they can't, utilize it. So my suggestion is don't copy Ben Shelton. Most of you cannot get down that low and definitely cannot come out that explosively. So we have to be careful. So less knee bend many times is actually better for many people, as long as we come out of wherever the load is and we come out of that quite quickly.
Would you say it's more important to keep the weight on that back leg then so that you can spring out of it, as opposed to if you transfer your weight too early, then you can't get that?
Yeah, it's in the good servers that are jumping 100%. That's probably one of the biggest coaching concepts that you have to get through to a lot of players, is getting that back leg to engage longer and to engage correctly. The challenge for many of you is if you don't jump, it changes your mechanics a little bit. If you keep your front foot on the ground as you hit the ball, you're still going to load your back leg because that's where a lot of good stuff happens, but you have a slightly different transfer of energy because you're not jumping vertically as explosively. So for many of you, you do jump, this all applies. If you don't jump, understand that and know that it's a slightly different vector. The vectors that are involved are slightly different. We've got less vertical, we've got more horizontal.
So you said that the speed in which the hip goes up is the most significant thing, but the distance of like the lowest point of that hip to the highest point, if you're not jumping, that's going to be much smaller.
Correct.
I've seen plenty of hard serves where there's no jumping at all.
Correct.
So how does that distance?
It's the velocity of the hip. It's not the distance of the hip.
So you're saying the distance is not.
The distance is not the different.
Distance and it's fast.
So Nick Kyrgios is a good example. He doesn't have a great distance in his knee bend. He has unbelievable velocity though. How quickly he goes from his limited depth to the explosion is as fast as anyone in history, really. You know, so that's why that's the most important thing. It's the velocity of the movement. It's not the distance of the movement. So it's a great, really good point to recognize. Some people will say, well, just do more knee bend. More knee bend by itself isn't the solution. It's effectively executing the knee bend is the important piece of it.
So as far as the back hip dropping, is it better to stick that front hip out more to kind of give that angle more, or is it better to drop the back leg lower?
Thank you for bringing that up. To me, that is unfortunately, the worst coaching cue in the history of serving. Stick your front hip out. So the question was, is it better to stick if this is the baseline, to stick your front hip out like that to help drop the back hip, or do we want to drop the back hip, which causes a little bit of the hip to go out? So it's an unbelievably important question, and unfortunately, in the 80s and 90s, when they saw, say, Sampras was really the one that got a lot of people interested in this, he had this really crazy bend, like really excessive bend, which was perfect. It was perfectly executed. The problem was people looked at the outcome. They said the hip's out over the baseline. So they started getting everyone to shift the hip out over the baseline. So the moment you do that, what happens? All your weight goes on your front leg, nothing goes on your back leg. If anyone watched Sampras serve, he had unbelievable back leg load. His back leg was like way lower. If this is his back hip and this is his front hip, that's what it looked like. The weight was going back and down into the back hip. As a result, the front hip did go forward, but that wasn't the cause, that was the effect. Too many people then started trying to mimic it, but they used the wrong coaching cue. They said, stick your front hip out. And that created a whole generation of pretty bad servers, actually. You know, for the coaches in here, we know that whole generation, especially on the female side, you saw a whole generation of really poor servers because they shifted their weight really far into the front hip. So don't overdo that in your mind as the cue. The cue needs to be drop into the back hip so that you've loaded well, and that front hip will come up and out a little bit, but that's not the driver, that's the result.
So really just focus on just dropping the back hip, whatever happens, happens.
Correct. You're gonna get in this position. So when you're in this position, that ends up going up a little, but it's the right hip for a right-hander that goes back and down.
Focus on that angle.
Correct. And just be careful you don't go too deep, because the first time people try that, they overdo it because they're trying to do it, and then they get really stuck and they get out of sync. So you want to make sure you don't go too deep into that position. And it's not just backwards, it's back and around. So it's a coil. So if I'm serving this way, some people will just do this. So they'll shift down like this. So if this is right here, this is my back hip, you don't want to just go this way. You actually want to get a little bit of turn, usually about 10 to 15 degrees. So you're in this position, so it's there. That's a much better position to be in rather than here. Because here is all you're really able to do is go back and down, which means you're going to really come up. So the problem we see with most servers is they'll drop into a knee bend, but they just go straight up. And if you just go straight up, what happens when you try to make contact with the ball? You end up having to collapse like this because your lower body's only going this way, and your upper body then has to find the ball, and then you end up collapsing. So that's one of the biggest things we see. So if any of you land on or behind the baseline, you're nearly always doing that. That's a typical giveaway because the butt has to stay back and the body leans forward, so your feet end up on or behind the baseline. So make sure that when we're loading and working on that we're not just going down, but we're actually rotating a little bit so that when we come out of it, we want to come up and out in that direction. Think about approximately a 45-degree angle we want to come up and out on. And again, we're getting into the weeds here, which I never like when we're talking about players, because the coaches know this, but the players need to think, okay, what can I do simply? The simple thing is slightly turn your hip back and down. That's it. That's the only cue you really need. Everything else is just trying to understand why. Let me go through. This is an interesting stat because if you're going to serve from that distance, you get this ability to land 1 to 2 feet inside the court. And if you're not landing inside the court, that gives us a sense of where our body position is and how it's the result that we're looking at here, but that tells us a story. We don't want to just think I want to land inside the court. Too many times people have done drills where they'll put a hurdle or they'll put something right here and they say jump over that. That's not a great cue either, because it may work for some of you, but the real goal isn't to work on the landing. It's not to focus on the landing. It's to focus on the load so that when we come out, our body naturally goes in that direction. So if that's a cue that is working for you, that's one thing. But I see a lot of times people overdo that because they end up focusing on the landing rather than focusing on the cause. So again, it goes back to cause and effect. Here's just an example. If we're looking at 2 different serve speeds, say 93 miles an hour and 110. So I'm not sure how many of you can serve 100. 100's a really, really good benchmark for a lot of club players. We're trying to get into that range. And this is an example of the difference between ball speed and racket speed. I want to make the point. Racket speed is significantly faster than ball speed. So if you're measuring racket speed, it's a whole different metric than ball speed. And then we have spin plays a huge role on this, obviously. You hit a slice serve, you're not going to hit a 110 mile an hour slice serve in this example. You're probably hitting a 90 mile an hour slice serve. So be real careful with how you are evaluating progress, because you may want to be improving your serve speed, but do you actually understand all the variables that go into it? And don't want to spend too much time on this, but just wanted to level set a little bit, because a lot of times people will simplify ball speed. Hey, I just want to hit the serve harder. Well, if you flatten out your serve and take all the spin out of it, you're adding 5 miles an hour without really changing anything. You're just taking the spin off the ball. Does that mean your serve's faster? No. It doesn't mean your serve's any better. It just means you've removed the spin, which may be valuable, but just be aware that it's pretty easy to adjust these numbers based on spin rate. So that's without changing technique. So be careful about what we're trying to evaluate there. So I want to go through, these few things I want you to be clear on. Understand, are you clear on your style of how you serve versus your fundamentals? Most people aren't. Most people think certain stylistic things are actually fundamentals, and most of the things people think of as important are actually style. And that's why there are so many great different looking servers out there, because their style is so different, and that's what makes the game great. But when you look at their fundamentals, there's a lot of consistency. The ground up concept, if you can keep that in mind, am I using the ground effectively? Am I actually leveraging the ground reaction forces correctly? It makes your life a lot easier, and it reduces your risk of injury, which to me is the biggest factor. We all want to serve a little better. We want to get more consistent with the serve. We want to do better from a performance perspective, but we also want all of you to be playing for the next 20, 30, 40 years at a good level. So using the ground effectively and keeping your body aligned right is super important. And when I say aligned right, most players that we evaluate, even at the highest levels, have some slight dysfunction in their body alignment while they serve. So what I mean by that is you want to stay side on as long as possible. So if I'm serving this way, I want to stay in this position here, side on, as long as I possibly can into contact. If I open up too early, way before contact, my shoulders and my hips start facing the net instead of my shoulders and hip facing the side fence. What happens? I have to get my head out of the way. I have to get my spine out of the way so that I can make contact with the ball. When that happens, everything falls to the left for a right-hander. That's when you lose your velocity, but more importantly, that's when you start putting a lot of pressure on your lower back, on your abdominals, and especially on your shoulder and your elbow. And those 4 areas are the red flag areas for all of you, long term. Lower back, abdominal strains at the higher levels. Abdominal strains are a real concern for poor servers. And when I say poor servers, it's some of the best pros in the world have problems with it because their serve technique is not ideal. And then shoulder and elbow issues because the shoulder and elbow have to end up coming through faster here because all our body weight's going this way. If our body weight's going this way, the arm comes through pretty easily. And if you actually think about most of the best servers, they have very few of the typical serve-related issues, lower back issues, and elbow and shoulder issues. You know, if you think about the fastest servers, for example, like a John Isner, never really had any type of arm problems. Pete Sampras never had any type of arm problems. You know, Serena really didn't have any arm problems. You know, those are the servers that hit the most number of serves in their careers and hit it at a very high velocity as well. And they really didn't have a lot of the issues you would think they should have based on how hard they hit and how long and how often they served. So that's a good sign because we know the correlations with injuries and what we need to spend time on. Cause and effect is a huge factor. So just keep that in mind as you're working on stuff. And when you're back home with your pros, ask them, is this a cause and an effect that we're working on? Sometimes you'll get coached on an effect, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a coaching cue. But understand, is what you're trying to do impacting the effect? And that's trying to work backwards, which is a strategy. It's not a strategy I love, though. I much prefer to work on the cause and make sure that we fix the cause, because that cascade of events from the cause will turn into a positive outcome. And then the last one there, our eyes always go to contact. And the funniest, saddest thing I see is when I review all these videos that people send, is how amazing you all are at making the ball go, meaning that the ball actually hits the strings. How ugly some of these serves are is amazing as well, meaning that the body's going in the complete wrong direction, you know, they're landing in the wrong spot, their head is like this, their arm is like this, but they find a way to make contact. Because that's what we do. We're tennis players. We see a yellow thing and we see strings and we say the ball needs to hit the strings. The problem is that puts our body in such a compromised position many times that you do that over and over and over again, something's going to break at some point because it's not designed to do those movements that way. So that to me is always the biggest concern, is that you always find a way to make contact because you're competitors and that's what you do, but you do it many times in a completely wrong order, in the wrong direction, and that's where we hopefully want to work on some of that. So let's go some practical stuff. So I always use this slides because we've got the same serves from 3 different angles, and it's pretty hard to get that, to be honest. It's really hard to do that. The start is all stylistic. I don't care how you start. You can start however you want. Certain coaches have really defined ways they like players to start, and that's purely a preference. If you look at all the great servers, they all start a little bit different. Some start with a wider stance, some start with a narrower stance, some point their toe at the net post, some point their toe at the baseline, some people their toes even slightly pointed backwards. So start is highly, personal. And you want to be careful of how much you want to change your start, especially if you played tennis a long time. Your body's adapted to a certain cue or instinct, and if you make a major change on how you start, that may throw things off that you've done for 15 or 20 years. So you want to be careful on making significant changes if you've played a lot and served a lot, because your body's adapted. Doesn't mean it's adapted well, but it has adapted to whatever that is. So the release, this is where everyone struggles, obviously. Ball toss is what makes the serve so hard, because if you don't get the ball toss in the right spot, everything else becomes nearly impossible to do well. But we looked at so many serves to find those commonalities, and there's really only a couple big things that all good ball toss release folks do, is nearly all of them have a straight arm. The bending of the elbow and having a bent elbow creates so much variability in the release. You can get a lot of serve ball tosses in the right spot if you practice anything enough. But if your bent arm is doing it, there's just a little bit more variability there. Keeping the arm as straight as possible just removes a major variable of inconsistency. So that's one. So if you've got a bent arm, it just creates way more challenge getting the ball in the right spot. The next is, where does the ball come out of the hand? So when does the ball actually release from your fingers or your hand? Every good server is in a very narrow window of release. It's between the nose and the top of the head. So I say eye level, because when we say nose, some people get a little low. So I always say between the eyes and the top of the head. Really, really narrow. We're talking less than 6 inches of variability there. So if you release it too low, what happens? It gets out in front of you and you're chasing. If you release too high, it typically goes left or behind you too much. So it makes sense if you just think common sense wise. If we narrow the window that we release the ball, we actually have a much more reliable and consistent release pattern. So those are the two things that matter. Everything else you can stylistically do. A lot of people spend a lot of time on talking about the pressure of the fingers and how many fingers are touching the ball at the release, or should it be in the palm or should it be in the fingers. There are things that make it easier and harder sometimes, but for example, Serena let the ball roll down her fingers. It started in the palm and it rolled down her fingers. You probably wouldn't teach that to most of you. It just adds variability and unnecessary components to it. But it's technically not a fundamental. That's a style. So we don't coach it. I don't. I just say, hey, we got to make sure we have our arms straight, and we got to have the ball releasing somewhere between the eye and the top of the head. And then the third piece is direction of the arm. So if we release straight on, which many times people, especially beginners, sometimes are taught this because it's just an easier thing to say, release towards the net. That's not a great cue. The reason being is it limits your ability to turn your hips and do everything else right. Anyone that usually releases straight on nearly always over-rotates too much during the motion because they have to make contact. So based on all the good servers, they're going to release somewhere in this range of about 130, the arm, if we're using the clock, to about 3. And 3 may be too far for most of you. There are some players that can get away with that, but in general, it's 130 to 230 is where the arm should be in space when we release the ball. Another way to think about that is release your left arm for a right-hander towards the right net post. It's a pretty good target zone. So if you do those 3 things on the release, it gives you the best chance of success. Doesn't mean you'll have a perfect release every time. You're still human and you still don't always do things perfectly, but it takes away the majority of the variables and the error spots that most people struggle with. So hopefully that can help a little bit for people that struggle on the release. Loading, this is really, really important from a standpoint of, if you, yeah. Yeah.
Before you go to load. So, I don't know, at 100, 110 miles an hour, how much Magnus effect it would generate, but in terms of like toss height and that optimization, can you talk a little bit about that?
Great. So the question was really about toss height, I think is where the question is. I have never overly focused on toss height, ever. The reason being is people have made millions of dollars serving with such a wide variability in toss heights that tells us the toss height by itself isn't a fundamental. It's a style. It doesn't mean that toss height, there aren't things that are outside normal ranges. If you toss it 15 feet in the air, that's not very smart. Or if you toss it not high enough that it ever reaches ability to get your arm fully extended, and every serve is like that, that's too low. So we obviously know there are extremes on both of these, but in most normal ranges, we need enough height that the ball is at least going to drop slightly. How much of that is that? Is that 6 inches? Is that a foot? Is that 2 feet? I can give you examples of great servers that are anywhere in that zone. So I never really overly focus on toss height as a goal. The other reason being is toss height is hard for us to actually know what that is unless we're retrospectively looking at it. All of us, the moment our head looks upwards, we lose all sense of depth perception, pretty much. It's really hard to determine 3 inches, 6 inches once the ball's above our head, that difference. So it's a fair question everyone asks of and if you look at the spread of ball toss apexes between the top 100 pros, it's 1.5 to 2 feet difference. So if all those servers can have that much of a spread in their apex of how high they toss it, what are we talking about for all of us when we say toss height? We're really saying we have to get our body up higher, not necessarily our toss up higher. And that's usually where the discussion is wrong, because it's like, hey, let's fix what our body's doing by figuring out our toss height. And that's usually not the answer. The answer is we haven't come out of our legs well enough, we haven't fully extended our body, and that's why we're collapsing, or that's why we're not fully extended. It's very rare that your toss height is too low. Many times it is too high though, meaning that you're waiting too long. So you definitely don't want to feel like you're waiting here for the ball to come down before you go up. You have to make sure, always err on the side of caution of a lower toss than a higher toss. A lot of people will try to say, hey, increase your toss height because you're serving in the net. It's very rarely due to the toss height. It's usually due to you not getting out of your body well enough and you actually collapsing, like what we were talking about before, which brings the ball down. So sorry I didn't give you a simple answer of like, 1.5 feet above your racket, which is a good starting point. If you say 1.5 feet above your max extended racket height, that's about the max height you would want the ball toss to be. But there's a lot of variability there. So from a loading standpoint, this is lower body. Fix this. If there's one thing you could leave with today, make sure that you feel good about where you are in this position, how well you've loaded. And just from a practical standpoint, this loading position is the lowest point that your hip is in space at this point. So your hip will never be lower than this point. That's the definition of stage 3 loading. So we've stored the maximum amount of energy that we can in the lower body, and the next frame, you actually start vertically moving upwards. So that's the goal of this position, and making sure that we get, as we talked about before, that slight hip rotation. So if I'm serving this way, we want a slight hip rotation. So if this is 0 degrees, 10 to 15 degrees is ideal. We want a lower body, back leg load in this position. And then the upper body, realistically, most of the time takes care of itself if we're in the right lower body position. You'll hear a lot about lower elbow, high elbow. Those are real things. They happen to most players, even at the highest levels. But nearly always it's because their hip positions aren't correct. So if my hip is like this, and my elbow needs to get down to actually get back in here, what'll happen? I'll get into a low elbow position. If my hip is dropped correctly, my elbow naturally stays in this position and I don't have to drop it at all because my hip's in the right position. So if you're trying to fix an elbow issue height-wise, just be clear that are you fixing the elbow or do you need to fix the hip position first before we worry about the elbow? Too many times, again, we're trying to solve for an effect. We're not solving for the cause. So how many of you have dealt something with the elbow position? You've been told your elbow's too high, your elbow's too low, which is legitimate. You see it on video, the elbow's up here or your elbow's down here. Both of them aren't good, ideally. You know, the body's meant to be pretty symmetrical. So ideally, we want a 45-degree angle from the elbow to the elbow. So this type of position. That's an ideal position. Not that many players get there though. Even at the highest levels, there's a lot of players that struggle to get into that position.
Since you said the biggest factor for speed is how fast your posterior hip goes up, shouldn't we all be trying to jump? And if not, is there a wrong way to do it?
So yes, if your goal to serve well is speed, then yes, that you should be jumping. If your goal is to play forever and you've got bad knees and bad back and everything else, then maybe you shouldn't be jumping. So that comes down to what's the goal. If the goal is pure velocity and speed, jumping's going to give you the best result. No,
Is it the wrong way? Is it just jump vertically? Or
no, so that's a great point. We got to be careful that we're not thinking we're doing a vertical jump. Like a vertical jump is straight up. That's not the direction we want. We actually want the body to go back and down like that so that it comes up and out like that. Because again, we want to make contact out here. We don't want to make contact up here. If we were going to do a vertical jump, our contact point would be literally right here. And for many players, they do a vertical, they don't realize it, but the ball's out here. So what happens? Their lower body's in this position. They're actually opened like this. Their lower body's straight, but their upper body's collapsed because they want to make contact out there. And that's where we get all the problems. And we get the lack of pace, and we get all the injury risk issues as well. So if you're losing control on your serve, ask yourself, is that potentially one of the reasons? So upper body position, this is the toughest position for many of you to get into. You can get into stage 3, most of you. Feel pretty good about most of you getting to a relatively positive stage 3 position. Stage 4 is really hard if you don't have the right range. You know, this is the thing that over time, due to injury, due to age, usually gets restricted. You have thoracic extension issues that get restricted, and then you have max external rotation issues that are restricted in your shoulder. Those two factors limit your ability to get into this position. So if you want to serve 140 miles an hour, you have to get into this type of position. Most of you, that's not the goal. The goal is, can I go from 80 to 85, or can I go from 85 to 90 or 95? Most of you, if you can serve 85 or 90, you can serve 95. But you got to work on this position a little bit. And this is more physical than anything else. This position is less about technique from a standpoint of, I know what I need to do technically, I'm going to do a technical cue. It happens too fast, and the racket's behind you, so you don't actually know where it is in space. It's really, really hard to feel this position for a player. The one thing, though, that does help for most people is if you keep the racket closer to your head as it comes down versus having it away from your head, it gets it down lower, and it gets you, wherever your max is, it gives you a better chance of getting to your max, rather than if the racket's out here somewhere and you're trying to get there that way, that gets really restricted and you just can't get the same range from that position. It's just basic biomechanics alignment issues of where we're trying to get the racket. Acceleration, so this is the upper body acceleration, which is really obviously important. It goes back to that long axis rotation position. So the goal here isn't about your arm for most of us when we're cueing this. The goal here is for our body to stay side on. The longer we can stay side on in this position, our chest pointing to the right side fence, our left deltoid ideally pointing to the net as long as possible. Some of you may have heard the term shoulder over shoulder position. That's what we're getting at. The longer you can stay in that position, the better it is going to be. The moment you open up early and you're coming through acceleration and your chest and your hips are pointing to the net, we've already lost velocity to an extent. But the concern is all these other parts of the body now need to do more work because we haven't fully leveraged our ground up summation of forces through the lower body, through the core, out into the arm, into the racket, into the ball. So that's the objective here, is to make sure that our body alignment allows all the good work, hopefully, that we've done previously to now be transferred. And again, we know how quick all this happens, so I don't expect you to remember all these pieces, but the goal is to at least understand where's the cause, where's the effect, and can we transfer our energy effectively. So contact, one big thing here that a lot of players mess up on is they don't stay that side on long enough. And one of the big things that may help is look at the left arm. Notice how the left arm is all the way into the belly button and it's sort of locked in this position. That's the same in baseball pitching, in football quarterbacks, in boxing. Anytime we've got an action that is high force action, you've got an opposing force on it for balance. And to be able to come through very explosively this way, we need a counter force to balance us so we don't fall flat on the face. Most of you, though, what happens is you've opened up too early, this arm is out here now, and your positioning is like this. So you've got your left arm all the way out here, your body's leaning left, and you're still trying to make contact up here. If we could shift it just slightly and stay in this position here, you're going to have a much faster serve, and it's going to be much easier on your body. So that's a cue that is something that could be helpful for you.
So, before that, when I hear this term, turn the light bulb, this,
Yeah.
and then this comes down. So what's the thesis behind, what's the practicality?
So really, really good point. I've never ever taught that. So what the question was is when you're releasing the ball, it's a natural occurrence of the arm. It's a little bit easier on the shoulder to turn your palm up. And the reason that'll only happen if your weight is shifted backwards. If your weight's shifted forwards, it really doesn't happen. If you're on the front leg, it only happens when you shift your weight back. So the cue you're talking about is again a result. It's not a cause. You can turn your arm all you like. That doesn't do anything for your serve. What it does do is and Andy's a good example of it. So if you look back, let me see, here. See how he released the ball and then the hand's pointing this way. That's because his weight is so far back on his back leg that caused that motion to happen. If you're just worried about the arm and just turning it, that does nothing for anything productive. The goal is this stretch, is what that created. That created this whole stretch through here, which was a result of back leg load and the weight actually center of mass moving backwards. So remember, for every action, we have to have an equal and opposite reaction. For us to go forward explosively, we have to store some of our energy backwards before we can do that. Think about a block start in sprinting. Push back to go forward, a jet engine. You know, it's the same concept. That's where that came from. But that by itself isn't helping you.
So it'll drop the arm so quick.
Yeah, exactly.
Turn the palm and it blocks the elbow.
Yep. So that's a really, really good point as well. If you've got someone that's overly dropping, like very, very early, trying to keep that arm up longer is a good cue. Really good point. So here's long axis rotation. So this is really hard for players that have had major shoulder surgeries and things to get back this total range. The main part of this is internal shoulder rotation. So if you've got restricted internal shoulder rotation, you really can't easily get into this position optimally. So if any of you have had shoulder things and your serve looks like this, kind of through after contact, that tells us we don't get into this position. This is the ideal position where we have the string side of the racket that makes contact with the ball pointing to the side fence. If our racket just goes like this, it's usually a sign either physically that you've got restriction and you just can't get in that position, which is possible, or technically you've opened up so early. It's really, really hard when you've opened up early to get into that position well. It's really uncomfortable. Whereas if I'm in this position, it's quite easy to get into that position. So those are usually the two main reasons you don't hit that position. One is a technical issue. You've fallen to the left, your body's opened, it's really hard to get back into that position. Or the second, maybe it truly is a physical limitation that your body doesn't like to get into that position.
So going back to the ball toss arm going into your body,
Yeah.
kind of keep yourself from over-rotating. When it's the right time to bring it back down, is it kind of a passive movement, or is it kind of like a little more conscious as you're going up at the same time?
Really good point. Did everyone hear that? Is it a passive movement, bringing that elbow down into the belly button, or is it more of a conscious movement? Ideally, it's passive. Ideally, it's not a thought in your mind. If you go back 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, that was never taught because no one really opened up. If you look back at players that learnt with wood rackets, you didn't open up. You really couldn't. The racket was too heavy. It was, if you had bad mechanics with a heavy wood racket, you would really quickly realize that's not the way to do it. You would change your body position. So it was never a thing to coach it, and I don't love that being a goal. It's more, if you're having trouble coming out, go back a bit earlier in the motion and figure out why, but then preferably it's much more passive movement. But every now and then it's not bad as a cue, just to give you an awareness of trying to get that in that right position. You just want to be careful that you don't come down too fast. Like if you come down too fast and collapse, that can be bad. But I don't think that many of you are doing that unless we overly think about this and then create another problem, which is always sometimes the challenge. When we do these sessions, you got so many thoughts in your head that you try them all at once and everything feels terrible. So again, go back to last night's discussion. No more than 2 things that you're going to try. The moment you start trying more than that, it becomes real challenging. Okay, let me just go to the finish because the finish doesn't really matter. Ball's gone. So how you finish is somewhat irrelevant. It is relevant to tell us if we did everything else right though. If we did everything else right, we're going to land and we're going to finish in the right spot. It's how the body works. It's if we store and load in one direction, we're going to release and execute in a different direction. And then we're going to land in the right spot. So a lot of times people try to fix problems earlier by trying to fix the landing. And that's not necessarily completely wrong. It can help to try to figure out, okay, I want you to land more to the right, or I want you to land a foot inside the baseline. That cue may help a little bit, but make sure we understand bigger picture what we needed to fix earlier. So don't rely on fixing your serve by fixing your landing. Figure out earlier in the motion what caused it, and that's a really important takeaway. Enjoy the rest of the Congress.